Today we're going to talk, we've already talked about Japanese aggression through the 1930s. Today we're going to go back to 1931 and add in what are all of the international responses to this Japanese aggression. So we're going to talk about what the League of Nations is going to do in response to Japan moving into Manchuria. We're going to talk about what China is doing in reaction to the actions in Manchuria. And then we'll talk about the United States. And we have to talk about the United States separate from the League of Nations because that's where our discussion is going to start. The United States, remember, never joins the League of Nations, right? And does anybody have a good memory as to why we don't ratify the League of Nations treaty, the Treaty of Versailles that creates the League of Nations? Yes, sir?
Wasn't it because there was too much equality in it?
The equality clause that Japan wanted was never put in. That was dead on arrival. That was never included as an amendment. So that's not it. Anyone else? What was the fear of American Republican senators? It's our Senate that ratifies treaties. What was their fear had the United States approved the Treaty of Versailles, which would have put us in the League of Nations? Yes, sir? Very good. We would have gotten dragged into European squabbles. We would have been forced into issues that might not have mattered to us as we have an Atlantic Ocean that separates us from Europe. So we never ratify the League of Nations. Now, I want to take a quick time out here and talk about the 1920s and how Europeans and even Americans are feeling in the 1920s and what they thought about the war that they just fought and what they thought about future wars that might one day come. And we want to caution ourselves really quickly to not fall into the trap of the history student that forgets that he knows far more than what these players knew in the 1920s. All right? When the League of Nations is organized, this was Woodrow Wilson's baby, right? This is the most important of his 14 points. He wanted to create an international organization that would provide a forum, a place for nations to talk. And so disputes can be dealt with through negotiations and through diplomacy rather than through war. And he also wanted the League of Nations to provide what is called collective security. Collective security is security coming from an organization like the League to where if one country is threatened or if one country is acting aggressive, the entire League will offer resistance to that. You won't attack a weak nation because that weak nation is a member of a League of Nations that is a collective security organization that will protect it. So if you attack that weak nation, you will have powerhouses like Britain and France and eventually Germany and Japan and eventually Russia siding against you. So collective security will come. Now, what do we as modern people know about the League of Nations? Yeah. It won't work. We know that World War II is going to happen. We know that aggressive powers will take over weaker nations in the 1930s. We know all that. But in 1920 and 21, when this is being organized, they don't know that. Can we fault them for being short-sighted or being foolish? I don't know. How can they look into a crystal ball and know what we know? And also, it's not just what they don't know because it hasn't happened yet, but what do they know? What do they know in 1925 or 1931 when Japan is invading Manchuria? What do they know in 1931 that we just can't understand today? Yes, sir?
How bad?
None of us. I mean, we can read in books and we can watch movies that are powerful dramatizations of what war looks like. But we don't know what it's like to have our nation be mired in the worst conflict in human history. All right? We weren't around for it. We didn't see it or feel it ourselves. We don't know what they know. They just got out of fighting the worst war mankind had ever fought. They don't want another one of those. So it's kind of this double issue of not being able to predict the future, and we can't blame them for that, but having just lived through the worst of warfare. And so it shouldn't surprise us that during the 1920s, we have this internationalist sentiment This idea of the world should stand together to avoid future conflicts. And organizations like the League of Nations can do that. We can't fault them for that. But the League of Nations has no military or economic enforcement unless its member nations agree to it. So if there is an aggressive power like Japan, the League of Nations doesn't have its own army. It doesn't have its own military wing that can go out against Japan. It only can have the militaries of its member states if they agree to participate. And further, as we've already said, we aren't a member of it. And that's important going forward. We aren't in the League of Nations. We are the most powerful economy in the world by the 1920s, the largest economy in the world. And we're not taking part in this organization. That's important going forward. I want to also mention another agreement of the 1920s that gave 1920s people hope that future war would be avoided. And that is called the KelloggBriand Pact. In 1929, dozens of nations of the world got together and signed an agreement that essentially outlawed war. It said no more war as a means to solve international disputes. So if any of these countries that are signing on to the KelloggBriand Pact, and that's Germany, and that's Japan, and that's Russia, and that's France, and that's the United States even, and Britain, if any of those countries have a dispute with each other, they will negotiate. They will talk it out. They won't go to war. Again, what does this sound to us? Like when we hear this, it kind of does what to us? Sounds ridiculous, right? Sounds crazy. Sounds like I have a good idea to stop gun violence. Let's get rid of all guns. It sounds nice, but is it actually feasible? Because what if there's that one guy that held on to a few? Now we've got a problem. What if there's one country that actually wants to push war despite this agreement? Now we've got a problem. So the KelloggBriand Pact is a nice sentiment. And I don't think we can fault those in 1929 that loved it. And in fact, if we can look at this like sub-headline, it says, after the Senate, again, Senate ratifies treaties. After the Senate approves the KelloggBriand Pact, the galleries roar in applause. Yay! Everybody's excited about this, right? Or at least the majority to approve it. We can't fault them because they know what war was. And they know what they want to avoid. And they don't know what's on the horizon for them. Okay? But again, just like the League of Nations itself, there's nothing in the KelloggBriand Pact that compels nations to enforce it. How do you enforce an agreement that says no war? You know what I'm saying? Like, what is likely the only way to enforce an agreement that says no war? War, and that's kind of like a catch-22, right? So there's no enforcement here. It's a sentiment. So now let's push to the actual crisis. 1931, we remember Japan following what's known as the Mukden incident, when there's an explosion at the South Manchurian Railway that Japan blames on Chinese troops. The League of Nations, their actions following this, China, to its part, China will beg the League of Nations for assistance here. League of Nations, this is everything that you're supposed to be dealing with. League of Nations, this is why you exist. And so the League of Nations will do what the League of Nations can do best. They will hold meetings. They will discuss it. Meetings that Japan is a part of. Japan's an important player in the League of Nations. Okay, Japan is one of the permanent members of the League of Nations Council. They're one of the winners of World War I. So Japan is in on these meetings. And it is decided at these meetings that a fact-finding mission will be put together and sent to Manchuria. The League of Nations will organize a group of officials to go to that South Manchurian Railway and to investigate what's going on. This will be called the Lytton Commission, Lytton, named after the British Lord Lytton that leads it. And the Lytton Commission will go to Manchuria and it will investigate and it will bring back its findings in a report. Japan is supportive of this. Japan is inviting the Leighton Commission to go. Now, what does Japan really know in its heart of hearts? Who did it? This was not a Chinese sabotage. This was orchestrated. But here's what Japan knows as well. That the Leighton Commission has to be organized. That the Leighton Commission has to get to East Asia. That the Leighton Commission has to investigate. That the Leighton Commission has to organize its report. That the Leighton Commission has to go back to Geneva, Switzerland, where the League of Nations meets, and issue its report. That the League of Nations will have to sit and hear this report, and then decide what next step to take. What is this all going to mean for Japan and Manchuria? It's a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of time for this to happen. And Japan knows it. And their hope, and they're right, their hope is that by the time this is all said and done, and they can probably predict that the League of Nations will not be happy with Japan, but by the time that this is all said and done, Manchuria will be taken over. And in fact, they're right. Manchuria, by the time the Leighton Commission issues its report, more than a year after the original incident at Mukden, Manchuria is now Manchukuo, according to the Japanese. Puyi is now the puppet emperor of Manchukuo. The Japanese military have conquered Manchuria. So even after the Leighton Commission report is released, that says to Japan, that's not cool, Japan. You should get out of Manchuria. Manchukuo is not an independent state. And you should talk with China and resolve your differences. By the time the League of Nations is issuing this report that condemns Japanese actions in Manchuria, the deed is done. And Japan, for its part, when it listens to this report and when it hears this condemnation from the League of Nations, they say, all right, we're done. And they leave the League of Nations. They storm out of the League of Nations. And they show what the League of Nations really can do in the face of an aggressive power. Because if you're aggressive and the League of Nations tells you to stop, and your response to the League of Nations is to leave the League of Nations, and nothing else happens, what does everyone around the world learn about the League of Nations? It's powerless. It's impotent to stop any aggressive power. And we will talk next week about Benito Mussolini in Italy, who is certainly watching this story unfold. And we will talk about Adolf Hitler in Germany, who is certainly watching this story unfold. Japan is like the test case for what the League of Nations will really do. The League of Nations does nothing but condemn. Why? Why doesn't the League of Nations go further? Why don't the member nations of the League of Nations organize armies? Let's hear what reasons you have, Mr. Tech. Dude, war is bad. And they all know, this is happening in 1932 now, right? They all remember what World War I was. If you're a member of the League of Nations, if you're a member of a nation's parliament or our Congress, you know what war was all about. And you don't want war. Now, let's go a step further with that. Would you want war if you were attacked? Maybe no, but you'd do it. They're not seeing their own interests threatened. And further, if this was a war, if a war was to come, where is that war going to be fought? Yeah. Be fought in Asia. Who would that war be fought for? Manchurians and Chinese? How does the average white Briton or Frenchman or German feel about East Asians, would you imagine, in the 1930s? Probably don't have a whole lot of consideration. Probably don't feel like they are on equal levels of the human race with them. There's a lot of racism, a lot of racist sentiments. What would have to happen to go to war? Young British boys, French boys, German boys would be sent across the world to fight and possibly die. Is this something that French moms and dads would be excited about seeing happen? No. And what do the leaders of Britain and France and Germany in 1932 have to recognize about their nation and their leadership positions? Yeah. It can fall. Why? How can they fall? How can governments fall in a place like Britain, in a place like France? Yes. Public's angry, and then the public does what next election? Votes you out. These are democratic states. Many nations of the League of Nations are democratic states. So they have to listen to the will of the people, and they know the will of the people would not support going to war in Manchuria. If you guys need to leave, just step up. That's okay. They would not support war in Manchuria. So can't get our minds behind war. Give me more reasons why the League of Nations won't be supportive of a war. What else was going on in 1932? The Great Depression. So what?
No one has any money
Okay.
to fund anything.
When nations are concerned about domestic financial issues, do they want to start pouring money into a war in East Asia? Probably not. And let's take that another step further. Japan in 1932 has the fourth largest economy in the world. Japan is an important trading partner with all of the great powers, great economic powers of the world, including Britain and Germany and France and the United States. So are you going to, while your country is dealing with an economic depression, are you going to cut off trade with one of your greatest trading partners and go to war with them? Maybe not. Certainly not for an issue like Manchuria. So the League of Nations will do nothing. Let's add one more reason in there. We always want to remember the United States. Because we are not a member of the League, if the League pushes for war, we're not going to be in it. If the League pushes for economic punishments of Japan, we don't have to sign on to those. So if the League of Nations can punish Japan economically, yet we can keep doing trade with them, or even grow our trade with them, that weakens the position of the League. Does everybody see that? Okay, cool. So the League of Nations will do nothing. Japan withdraws from the League of Nations. And that's it. Good? Good. All right. Now we talk about China's reaction to the actions in Manchuria and later. Do we recall what the situation in China is in the late 1920s, very early 1930s? Yeah. Jiang Xiu and Mao Zedong. We have a civil war in China. We remember we talked about last week. There was an attempt to unify China, where the nationalists of China, led by Jiang Xiu, and the communists of China, led by Mao Zedong, formed this united front, and they were trying to consolidate Chinese territory. But that relationship fell apart, and they ended up warring against each other in what is the beginning of the Chinese Civil War. All right? So when Manchuria is invaded in 1931, Jiang Xiu's forces are still fighting Mao Zedong's forces. And we even remember what Jiang Xiu believed about, like the Japanese he thought were a threat, but not as dire a threat as the communists were. All right? And here's a little more ammunition to put in our arsenal for why the League of Nations doesn't react. Keep in the back of your mind, when Manchuria was invaded and taken over, conquered by China, or conquered by Japan, and then China started bombing Shanghai, and the Jiang Xiu government, the nationalist government of China, signed a treaty with Japan, right? That Treaty of Tangu said, okay, Manchuria, we're not going to mess with it. Manchuria can be Manchukuo, move on, all right, to stop bombing us. So if China themselves, if Jiang Xiu themselves aren't fighting against the Japanese to grab Manchuria back, why should any other European nation, right? If it's not important enough for China to fight for, why should any other nation? But it's important for some in China. This guy's name is Jiang Xiu Liang. Jiang Xiu Liang. Jiang Xiu Liang is a son of Jiang Xiu Lin. Now, I know these names are very difficult because we've never come across them before. But you recall me mentioning Jiang Xiu Liang last week. He was that Manchurian warlord, right? As China was like all divided, he was the guy that was in power in Manchuria before Japan came in and took it over. And Japan was actually working with Jiang Xiu Liang until he started pushing too far and they assassinated him. All right? Jiang Xiu Liang is Jiang Xiu Liang's son. Jiang Xiu Liang is a Manchurian warlord without a Manchuria. He wants to be the leader of Manchuria, but Japan now has Manchuria. They call it Manchukuo. It has a puppet emperor named Puyi in charge of it. Jiang Xiu Liang wants Manchuria. He wants the Japanese out. But the problem is, China isn't helping with it. Because what's China doing? They're civil warring. Jiang Jieshi and Mao Zedong are fighting a civil war in China. He wants them to focus their efforts on Japan in hopes of winning and defeating and driving out the Japanese, and he can have a power position back in Manchuria. So to make this story all the more crazy, Jiang Xiu Liang, in December of 1936, will kidnap Jiang Jieshi. This is crazy, right? Chiang Kai-shek. He kidnaps the nationalist leader of China, who is, at the time, fighting a civil war against Mao Zedong. What? This is mental. Lin-Manuel Miranda should make a hip-hop musical about what's going on in China in the 1930s. It is a crazy story. Now, he doesn't kidnap him because he wants to kill him. He kidnaps him because he needs Jiang Jieshi and the nationalist Kuomintang army to fight against the Japanese. He needs Jiang Jieshi to stop a civil war and to start fighting against the Japanese. He needs Jiang Jieshi to recognize that Japan is a disease of the heart, and it needs to be dealt with immediately. So while Jiang Jieshi is in captivity, I'm even starting out his rhymes right now for the hip-hop musical that will come. While Jiang Jieshi is in captivity, a Chinese communist leader named Zhou Enlai, his name is not important for us now, but I just want you to hear it because he's going to be an important story during the Cold War. A Chinese communist leader, kind of like Mao Zedong's right-hand man. Oh, I hear another song coming to be. Zhou Enlai is going to go and meet with Jiang Xiu Liang and Jiang Jieshi. Maybe they can work out an agreement. And ultimately, Jiang Jieshi will agree to end the civil war and focus his forces against the Japanese. And so the communists in 1936, the communists and the nationalists in China will form what is known as the Second United Front. That civil war that had been going on for a decade will come to an end. And now a war of national resistance will be organized against the Japanese. All right? So the communists and the nationalists are now on the same page. Good? Yes?
What was the name of
The Second United Front.
Thank you.
The First United Front was like that attempt to organize China into one centralized state back in the 1920s. All right. Please don't be under the impression, though, that if you are Chinese, you are either on Jiang Jieshi's side or Mao Zedong's side. There are other Chinese in the mix that see this thing going in a different direction. When war breaks out between Japan and China in 1937, what is known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, when Japan invades mainland China, that war will go poorly for Japan. It will go poorly for China as well. But where Japan hoped that it would be an easy victory and China would surrender amidst the horrible atrocities committed by the Japanese that we talked about the other day, Japan doesn't get the surrender they were hoping for. China continues to fight a war against the Japanese. And they will continue that fight until 1945, until the war ends. But some Chinese, when they looked at the situation of war between Japan and China, some Chinese said, I think Japan is going to win. And when Japan wins this war, I want to be set up myself. And one name I want you to be familiar with is Wang Jingwei. Wang Jingwei. Wang Jingwei was a former Kuomintang leader, a rival of Chiang Kai-shek's, a rival of Jiang Xiu's. He didn't like Jiang. And so Wang is going to work out a deal with the Japanese. And the Japanese will name Wang Jingwei the leader of what they call the new government of China. The eastern portion of China that Japan had conquered. Just like they propped up Puyi as the emperor of Manchukuo, the Japanese will prop up Wang Jingwei as the leader of this new government in China. Now, what do you think Mao Zedong and Jiang Xiu will think of this guy? He's a traitor, right? He's a traitor. He's a turncoat. He's in the Japanese back pocket. But he's hoping that Japan wins the war. Now, ultimately, Japan will not win the war. The war won't. He won't even get to see the end of the war. He's going to be shot by an assassin, and a few years later, he will die of those injuries in Japan. So he doesn't even live out the end of the war. But I do want you to understand that not every Chinese person is organized in fighting against the Japanese. Some are willing to capitulate to the Japanese, to give in to the Japanese. All right, good? Cool. Last thing we're going to talk about is the American response. Now, America is in a unique position in that we have an Atlantic Ocean to our east and a Pacific Ocean to our west. We have thousands of miles separating us from this conflict in Asia. During the 1930s, with those oceans protecting us, we would take a policy of isolationism, to remain isolated and outside of foreign wars. We didn't want to get involved in wars in Asia. We didn't want to get involved in wars in Europe. Please, though, recognize that American isolation in the 1930s was not like we said Japanese isolation in the 16 and 1700s was. While we were isolated militarily, we were very much involved economically. Okay? We were bringing exports into our country. We were selling goods to foreign nations. We were taking part in international treaties and agreements. We were a major player in the world. We just weren't a military player in the world. All right? We're an isolationist nation. And as the world starts to heat up in the mid-1930s, as we see tensions in Asia, and as we see tensions in Europe, the United States will remain an isolationist nation. Now, that's not to say we don't call out Japan when we think they're wrong. And Henry Stimson, he's our Secretary of State when Manchuria is invaded. He will denounce this move by Japan. He will condemn Japanese actions. But it will not be followed by any true military or economic response from the United States. So we wag a finger, but that's all. And while we're wagging that finger, we are still trading with Japan. And we are still trading with Japan the steel and the oil that they need to power their military. By the mid-1930s, the United States Congress commissions a study, and we're going to talk about this much more later, but the United States Congress commissions a study to look into why the United States got into war in World War I. And the findings of this report say that the United States joined World War I because we loaned far more money to the British and the French than we ever did to the Germans. In the early years of World War I, when we were a neutral nation and sell to anyone who was buying, we were willing to sell to the Germans, we were willing to sell to the British. But through the course of the war, We sold far more to the British. We made far more loans to the British. Why? Someone take a stab at why we ended up loaning so much more to the British and the French than we did, and shipped so many more goods to the British and French than we did to the Germans. Yes, sir.
No, I want to hear you guy, Mr. You.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Ben. Very good. So there are cultural ties with Britain, for example. But I think more practical, Britain is, one, closer. It's easier, literally easier for us to get to Britain to ship. And the British blockade cut Germany off. We couldn't get shipments into Germany because the blockade stopped us. So those two combinations, led to us loaning far more money to the Allies. What happens to those loans if the Allies lose the war? Never get paid back. We're out. So we have an economic interest in the British and the French winning that war. So our loans can be paid back to us after the war. Because of this report in the mid-1930s, the American Congress will pass a series of laws called the Neutrality Acts. The Neutrality Acts meant to keep the United States out of foreign wars. The Neutrality Acts, and we'll go into more depth of these later in the year, but the Neutrality Acts forbid the United States from selling arms or even trading goods to nations that are fighting wars with each other. We aren't allowed to pick economic sides anymore. And this will hamstring a president like Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, elected American president in 1932, re-elected in 36, re-elected in 40, re-elected in 44. Our only president to win more than 2 terms in office. All right, he won 4 elections. He died in 1945. Franklin Roosevelt actually wants the United States to get more involved in this issue in Asia, especially once Japan invades mainland China. But Franklin Roosevelt is kind of hung up by the Neutrality Acts, and he's hung up by American support. And the American people don't want to see war. This is a poster that comes from a little later, but from an organization called the America First Committee. This massive popular movement that strove to keep America out of foreign wars. This is what Roosevelt was working against. But despite the Neutrality Acts, Franklin Roosevelt would start offering financial and even later military aid to the Chinese. Because there's a loophole in the Neutrality Act. The Neutrality Acts say you can't ship to countries in war. But even though what is happening in China looks like a war, smells like a war, sounds like a war, it was never a declared war. Japan never declared war on China, and vice versa. It wasn't a declared war. So Franklin Roosevelt would circumvent the Neutrality Acts. Now, obviously, the spirit of the Neutrality Acts was these countries are at war. You shouldn't ship to them. Roosevelt did. And then, not long after the invasion of China, a Japanese ship will bomb an American gunboat in the Yangtze River in China. Yes, sir?
Did the Neutrality Act get repealed?
Yeah, we're jumping ahead. I think they were ultimately ended by like 1941, mid-1941. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
A Japanese plane will sink an American gunboat in the Yangtze River. Yes?
Will this stop U.S. giving like trading?
Not quite yet. Not quite yet. So this is crazy. Japanese Air Force bombs an American gunboat. Why do we have American gunboats in the Yangtze River? Same reason the Kwangtung Army was in Manchuria. We have economic interests there. We have a military there that protects it. This is what's been happening to China for decades. All right? Foreign armies are in China. So we've got a gunboat in the Yangtze River. It is bombed by Japanese planes. Japan immediately comes out and says, whoa, our bad. Sorry about that one, America. Let us give you some money to compensate you for your losses. Because sometimes stuff happens in war, right? Japan's immediate apology, softens things with the United States. All right, we're not happy, but okay, we'll take your money and we'll continue to trade with you. But stories like this start to turn American sentiments against the Japanese. And as we push forward, by January of 1939, with the war in China continuing, the United States and Franklin Roosevelt will launch what we call a moral embargo against the Japanese. We don't think what you're doing in China is right. We're seeing the pictures of the atrocities of the rape of Nanking. We don't think it's right. So we're going to put a moral embargo on you. We're not going to completely stop shipping oil and steel to you because we make a lot of money off of that. But we won't sell you aircraft parts, replacement parts for your planes. We won't ship those to you. And other new planes that you might have ordered, we're not going to ship those to you anymore. So we're going to start cutting some things because you're bombing civilians, Japan. That ain't cool. But oil we'll still send you. The oil that will be refined and turned into gasoline and fuel for those airplanes, we'll still ship that to you. So we're taking a step, but we're not taking a very big step here. This will change as the war presses on, as we get to 1941, as Japan is now looking more aggressive in Asia, as they begin to push more troops into Southeast Asia. The United States will support China now with a shipment of airplanes. We send 100 P-40 fighter planes and more financial aid to the Chinese nationalists to fight the Japanese. And by July of 1941, as we talked the other day, we will freeze Japanese assets in the United States and launch an all-out embargo against any shipments to Japan. Now the oil is included. Now the steel is included. Yes?
What year again?
41.
Thank you.
This is what gets Japan to start planning for the Pearl Harbor attacks. Negotiations with the United States to reopen trade fail. December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. December 8th, 1941, the United States declares war. And it is a nearly unanimous declaration of war by the American Congress. Only one lone senator votes against it. Her name is Janet Rankin. Votes against joining the war effort. So the United States declares war, and the United States is at war. Here is a picture of Franklin Roosevelt signing that declaration of war. Yes?
How does the public feel about
War. After Pearl Harbor, the public is ready for it. Absolutely. The America First Committee dies. No one else is going to be left in it because war is now... World War II is often called the good war by Americans. This was a war where the United States can plainly see it was attacked. So there is virtually universal support of this declaration of war. Good?